Game of Thrones, Slayer system killing my way to top ch 11 to 20. Chapter 11, The Bastard, Jon Snow. Winterfell had changed. The air was no longer filled only with cold and tranquility. Instead, it was replaced by a clamor mixed with excitement, tension, and anticipation. The king was coming. This news was like a gust of wind, blowing through every corner of the castle. In the kitchens, the aroma of baking bread lingered 24 hours a day. The fires in the smithy burned all night, the hammering never ceasing. Guards needed to polish every piece of armor. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying piles of clean linen, their footsteps quick and light. Lady Catelyn Stark was the center of this storm. She was like a tireless queen bee, orchestrating the entire castle's operations with precise and strict commands. I want the best ale from the cellar. Change all the bed linens in the guest rooms to new ones, scented with lavender. Tell the stable boys to scrub down all the horses for the king's procession, not a stray hair is allowed. Her voice echoed clearly and powerfully in the courtyard. She organized everything methodically, a capable woman. But deep in those blue eyes of House Tully, there hid a trace of anxiety that couldn't be dispelled. Ned Stark, on the other hand, kept himself completely out of it. He didn't appear in the courtyard, nor did he ask about any preparations. He simply stayed alone in his study or went to the God's Wood. He polished the Valyrian steel greatsword, ice, over and over again. As if only this could bring a moment of peace to his heart. Lynn sat on the steps leading to the armory, feeling this undercurrent. Since the prophecy was confirmed, he was no longer a prisoner. On the contrary, Catelyn and Ned treated him with courtesy. Lynn had a warm room. His 3 meals were no longer black bread and cold water, but freshly baked soft bread and hot meat broth. He even had a long sword of his own. All of this was earned through that bloody fight and the mysterious prophecy. Lynn's gaze moved past the busy courtyard to Theon Greyjoy, who was practicing archery in the distance. The face of this ward from the Iron Islands was full of excitement about meeting the king. Although called a ward, he was actually a hostage taken after the Greyjoy rebellion. But the Starks didn't treat him differently. Ned regarded him as his own son, teaching him etiquette, skills, and the loyal mindset of the Wolf family. Theon's posture as he drew the bow became increasingly dashing. Every arrow hit the bullseye, drawing cheers from the stable boys around him. Theon enjoyed this feeling of being the center of attention. Unlike the Stark children, he couldn't feel the heaviness hidden beneath the glory. For Theon, this was just a grand party. Lynn withdrew his gaze. He knew that beneath this superficial harmony, cracks had long existed. Just then, a figure walked into the courtyard. It was Jon Snow, the knower of nothing. He wore simple leather armor and carried a blunted practice sword, walking silently toward the training dummy in the corner. He didn't join Robb and Theon. He was always like this, habitually choosing a spot that wasn't so noticeable. At that exact moment, Lady Catelyn walked out of the main keep, preparing to inspect the stables. Her gaze met Jon's briefly in the air. Just for an instant. The relatively gentle expression on Catelyn's face froze instantly. All warmth vanished from those blue eyes, leaving only icy disgust. She didn't say a word. She simply turned slightly sideways and quickened her pace. As if looking at Snow for one more second would dirty her eyes. Jon's body stiffened. The sword he had just raised stopped in mid-air. The expression on his face looked as if a winter wind had blown across it, all the light faded away. He silently lowered his arm and bowed his head, his black hair covering his eyes. Lynn took it all in. Catelyn's hatred was so naked, so undisguised. In Westeros, bastards were a public shame for noble families. Their surnames were standardized: Snow in the north, Storm in the Stormlands, Sand in Dorne. It varied by region, but locals knew at a glance. Jon's existence was a constant reminder to Catelyn of her husband's infidelity. Men went to war, and sometimes they needed to release their desires. Leaving bastards behind was normal, and Catelyn understood this. But keeping them somewhere else was one thing. Ned insisted on raising him right under her nose. And whenever she asked about Jon's mother, Ned would get angry with her. She vented all her anger on Jon. Although she didn't abuse him physically, it could be said that Jon Snow grew up under the scornful gaze of Catelyn Stark. The clamor in the courtyard seemed irrelevant to Jon in this moment. He stood there alone, his figure appearing exceptionally lonely. Lynn watched all of this. He generally appreciated the character of Jon Snow. In the show, he certainly had his flaws, failing Ygritte, and stabbing Daenerys on Tyrion's advice to prevent another Mad King, which was essentially betraying his liege. But Jon was straightforward, loyal, a character with both good and bad traits. Lynn would never forget the scene of Jon drawing his sword alone against a cavalry charge to save Ned's youngest son, Rickon, in the Battle of the Bastards. Fear is biological instinct, courage is the hymn of humanity. Not everyone can bravely draw their sword. But sometimes, being too righteous isn't a good thing. However, Jon was still young. Lynn had plenty of time to make him less rigidly righteous. The thought of recruiting Jon rose in Lynn's mind. That evening, Lynn was in his room, carefully sharpening his long sword with a whetstone. The blade reflected his calm face. Maester Lewin's ointment was effective, the pain in his wound had lessened significantly. A light knock sounded on the door. "Come in." The door cracked open, and a head peeked in. It was Jon Snow. Am I disturbing you?" Jon's voice was hesitant. "No." Lynn put down the whetstone and pointed to the only chair in the room. Jon walked in and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down, but stood in the middle of the room, his hands wringing together somewhat awkwardly. "You're a night's watchman," Jon finally said, his gaze falling on the long sword in Lynn's hand. Lynn acknowledged. "So, what is it like, beyond the wall?" Jon's eyes held a trace of a young man's curiosity and longing. "It's cold," Lynn answered simply and directly. "Colder than Winterfell. The wind is like knives, it scrapes right into your bones. The Night's Watch, what kind of men are they?" This was what Jon really wanted to ask. "All kinds." Lynn leaned back in his chair, looking at him. "Thieves, rapists, debtors, knights who lost their lands, and people like me. Of course, there are also some noble sons who go for honor," Lynn added. "Just very few." Jon fell silent. Lynn's words were completely different from what he had imagined. In his imagination, the wall was a place full of honor. There, birth no longer mattered. Everyone was a brother in black, defending against threats from beyond the wall together. On the wall, does a man's birth really not matter? Jon's voice was low, carrying a hint of uncertainty. "Can a bastard also earn respect?" Lynn looked at him. Looked at this future Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Looked at the confusion and vulnerability on his face that didn't match his age. At the wall, men only care about your skill with a sword, and whether you dare to stand at the front when the wildlings charge. Lynn's voice was calm. "Whether your name ends in Snow or Stark, nobody cares. They only care if you are reliable." Jon's eyes slowly lit up. It was the light of finding where one belongs. "But," Lynn changed the subject. "It is not a home for heroes, Jon. Once you wear the black, you must give up your family name, lands, never take a wife, never father children. Your entire life will be dedicated to that cold wall. Until you die." The room fell into silence. Only the wind outside the window howled. The light on Jon's face faded bit by bit. He wanted to escape Winterfell, escape Lady Catelyn's cold gaze. But he had never thought the price would be so heavy. "I understand," Jon whispered after a long time. "Thank you, Lynn." He turned to leave. "Jon," Lynn called out to him. Your father loves you very much. Jon's footsteps paused. It's just that sometimes, love cannot solve all problems. Lynn looked at him, speaking word by word. What kind of person you become is ultimately a choice you have to make yourself. Jon didn't look back. He just stood at the door, his shadow stretched long under the dim light. Then, he pushed the door open and walked out. Chapter 12, Light Sword. The night deepened. Most of Winterfell had fallen into silence. Only the footsteps of patrolling guards echoed in the empty courtyard, along with the occasional whinny from the stables. Lynn's room was on one side of the main keep, near the kitchens. The flames in the hearth had shrunk to a small clump of dark red embers, barely chasing away the chill in the room. Lynn sat cross-legged on the bed. The long sword Ned Stark had bestowed upon him lay across his knees. He wasn't sleeping. He was waiting. Knock, knock, knock. A tapping sound, so faint it was almost inaudible, sounded on the wooden door. Lynn opened his eyes, the corners of his mouth curling up slightly. He got off the bed and slid back the bolt. A small figure slipped through the crack in the door, moving as agilely as a cat. Arya Stark, clutching a wooden practice sword taller than herself, darted into the room. She closed the door behind her and let out a long breath, her face full of the excitement of a successful prank. The guards think I'm asleep, Arya whispered triumphantly. She placed the practice sword on the floor and dusted off her hands. Her eyes burned with a desire hotter than the embers in the fireplace. Remember our agreement? Teach me. Lynn didn't waste words. He picked up his own long sword and twirled it in the dim room. The steel cut through the air, emitting a faint hum. The Night's Watch swordsmanship has no name, Lynn said, looking at Arya. It has only one purpose, to kill the enemy in the shortest time possible and keep yourself alive. It isn't pretty. It's even ugly. Arya nodded vigorously. I know. Lynn cleared a small space in the center of the room. Watch closely. He assumed a standard starting stance. Center of gravity low, sword point angled toward the ground. It was a posture that emphasized stability and explosive power to the extreme. When an enemy chops at you, Lynn simulated a blocking motion. He didn't use brute force to meet it head-on but used the angle of the blade to deflect the imaginary enemy's attack. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the sword tip thrust out. Simple, vicious, aiming straight for vitals. Defense is always preparation for the next attack, Lynn sheathed his sword. Many wildlings beyond the wall are taller and stronger than us. If you try to match their strength, the one who dies will be you. Arya watched unblinkingly. She raised her wooden sword, trying to mimic Lynn's movements. Lynn interrupted her and handed her his own sword. Wooden swords are toys for children. Use this. Excitement flashed in Arya's eyes. This was the first time she had touched a real sword. This was the real thing Catelyn always forbade her from touching. Arya took the heavy one-handed sword. Ha! She gave a small shout and thrust the sword out. But her movement looked a bit comical. The heavy sword dragged down her speed. Lynn picked up Arya's wooden sword to spar with her. When blocking, Arya's thin arms shook from the impact. When thrusting, she lacked sufficient penetrating power. It's not right, Arya stopped, frowning in frustration. I can't deflect the sword like you do. Lynn looked at her tense little face and trembling arms. He realized that although the set of Night's Watch swordsmanship emphasized technique, its foundation was still built on the strength of an adult male. For Arya, it was still too heavy. He had to make adjustments. Lynn thought for a moment and raised the sword again. This time, his movements changed. He no longer emphasized the solidity of the block, but focused on evasion and agile counterattacks. The blade no longer moved in straight lines with exhausting chops and stabs, but drew light arcs, specifically targeting gaps in the enemy's defense. Lynn's movements were smaller, faster. As Lynn immersed himself in conceiving this lighter, more agile swordsmanship tailored for Arya, the familiar blue panel quietly surfaced. Host has drawn inferences from other cases. Strength attribute met, agility attribute met. Successfully comprehended new skill. Congratulations host, obtained new skill, light sword, beginner, 1/10. Lynn's heart skipped a beat. This light sword style, born from the Night's Watch swordsmanship but distinctly different, was exactly what he currently lacked. When facing strength-based opponents, the one-handed sword style he was proud of seemed a bit stretched. He couldn't fight those types by matching strength. He could only drain their stamina through evasion. He just needed to deliver a fatal blow when the opponent was exhausted. Try this. Lynn broke down the prototype of this light sword into the most basic footwork and thrusts, teaching them to Arya. Arya's eyes lit up. She raised the iron sword again. This time, she didn't try to block. When Lynn tapped Arya's iron sword with the wooden one, she stepped back half a pace with the momentum, and simultaneously, her iron sword slashed toward Lynn's wrist from a tricky angle. So fast! Arya cried out in excitement. She felt like a fish in water, free from constraints. However, this excitement only lasted a moment. When she tried to attack continuously, the problem reappeared. Although the light sword didn't require as much strength, it demanded extremely high coordination and precision. Several of Arya's thrusts missed their mark. She stopped, panting, her small face flushed red. Still no good, Arya slumped her shoulders dejectedly. My sword is too heavy. She looked at the steel longsword in her hand, then at the wooden lump in Lynn's. She suddenly realized a cruel fact. I'm a girl, Arya's voice dropped low, carrying a trace of unwillingness. No matter how I train, my strength won't match Rob's, or Theon's. She looked up, her grey eyes full of confusion. This kind of swordsmanship still relies on strength to suppress the opponent in the end, doesn't it? Lynn fell silent. Arya's intuition was sharp. Even with light sword, under the battlefield logic of Westeros, ultimate lethality still relied on the strength to pierce armor or shatter bone. Lynn knew what Arya needed was a completely different fighting style. A swordsmanship that didn't rely on strength, but only on speed and precision. You're right, Arya, Lynn patted her head. You don't need to be the strongest. But you can be the fastest. Just then, messy footsteps sounded outside the door. Over there. I think I heard something. It was the night patrol. Arya's face went pale, and she grabbed Lynn's sleeve. Lynn quickly blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into darkness. He pulled Arya into the shadows behind the door. The footsteps got closer and finally stopped at the door. Lynn could clearly hear the guards breathing outside. Arya held her breath in tension, her small hands ice cold, hugging Lynn tightly. She was 2 years younger than her sister Sansa, only 9 years old now, but she knew she shouldn't be in a man's room at night. After a long while. Must have heard wrong. Let's go, another guard mumbled. Damn weather, even the wind sounds like ghosts. The footsteps faded away. Lynn and Arya looked at each other in the darkness and breathed a sigh of relief simultaneously. I should go back, Arya's voice trembled slightly. Tomorrow, can I come back tomorrow night? Be careful, Lynn helped her tidy her messy hair. There are many eyes in the castle these days, the king's caravan is arriving soon. Arya nodded vigorously and disappeared silently at the end of the corridor like a little deer. Lynn closed the door and relit a candle. He looked at the longsword in his hand, then at the light sword, beginner, 1/10 on the system panel. Although Arya hadn't learned it, he had gained a lot. Lynn knew he needed to improve his strength as soon as possible. The arrival of the king meant the center of the storm had shifted to Winterfell. And he was already in the eye of the storm. Chapter 13, The Bold Arya. Several days had passed. Winterfell was like a kicked hornet's nest, buzzing with activity. The king's procession had already reached the White Knife. This news made everyone in the castle quicken their pace. The fires in the smithy burned day and night, the clanging of hammers almost drowning out the sounds of sparring in the courtyard. In the kitchens, Gage the cook shouted orders, directing helpers to move barrels of ale into the cellar. The scent of charred meat and freshly baked bread mixed in the icy air, drifting far. Lynn sat on the low wall leading to the god's wood. He was no longer under guard. That bloody battle, along with the fulfilled prophecy, had bought him this limited freedom. Lynn was a man of the Night's Watch, but Ned saw his usefulness and kept him temporarily at Winterfell. Eventually, however, he would be sent back to the Wall. Under Maester Lewin's care, Lynn's wound had scabbed over. The new skin itched slightly at the edges, bringing a real sensation of life returning. Lynn just watched quietly. He watched Robb and Theon sparring under Ser Roderick's guidance, training more strictly than ever before. Wooden swords clashed with dull, powerful thuds. He watched Sansa Stark, accompanied by her mother Catelyn, selecting fabrics for the feast. Sansa's face held a young girl's longing for the splendors of the South. He watched Jon Snow. Jon was still in that secluded corner, alone, swinging his practice sword again and again. Sweat soaked his black hair, but he didn't care. It was as if he wanted to vent all his energy into those silent chops. Everyone was busy. Busy welcoming a grand honor. Only Lynn knew they were busy welcoming a storm that would sweep across the Seven Kingdoms. Light footsteps approached from behind. Lynn didn't need to turn to know who it was. Arya had been pestering him for days. "They are all so stupid," Arya said with a hint of disdain. She mimicked Lynn and climbed onto the low wall, sitting beside him, swinging her legs back and forth. "Sansa only thinks about her prince. Theon only wants to show off in front of the king. Mother makes me practice embroidery, she says the ladies from the south will be watching me." Arya mimicked Lady Catelyn's tone, pitching her voice high and looking a bit comical. But there was no smile on her face. "I don't want them to watch me so. I don't want to so." Lynn turned to look at her. The little girl's face was full of a stubbornness that didn't match her age. "Then practice with your sword," Lynn said. He liked this Arya very much. "Ser Roderick won't teach me. He says swords are for boys." Arya's voice dropped, full of grievance. "Father said when winter is over, he'll let Bran and Rickon start learning too. Just not me." Lynn didn't speak. Instead, he pulled a thin twig from his chest pocket. Using the twig, he drew a crooked figure on the dusty wall. "Let me tell you a story," Lynn said softly. In the distant east, further than Essos, there was a girl. Her country was invaded by enemies. Her father was old and weak, unable to go to war. So, she cut her long hair, put on her father's armor, and went to the army in his place. Arya's eyes grew brighter as she listened. She stopped swinging her legs, completely absorbed. When Lynn finished, she asked impatiently, "Did no one discover she was a girl?" "They did," Lynn smiled. "But by then, she had already achieved great military exploits with her wisdom and bravery. She became a hero admired by all soldiers. In the end, she defeated the enemy and saved her country." Lynn used the twig to draw a crown on the little figure's head. "What was her name?" Arya pressed, her eyes shining like stars. "Mulan." Lynn said the name softly. "Mulan." Arya chewed on the strange pronunciation. This story wasn't like the knightly legends Ser Roderick told. Nor was it like the boring old myths about the children of the forest from Old Nan. There was no magic, no dragons. Only a girl and her sword. Yet it made her heart race more than any other story. "Do you know many stories like this?" Arya looked up at Lynn, her grey eyes reflecting his calm face. "I know many. Joan of Arc, Nightingale, Muguiying, Fu Hao, they were all great heroes, second to none. Then tell them all to me later, okay? Okay, Lynn nodded. The noise of the courtyard seemed far away. Sunlight pierced through the clouds, falling on the two of them, bringing a touch of warmth. Arya was silent for a long time. She looked at Lynn. At his always calm eyes, at his faded black cloak. He was different from everyone in Winterfell. Her father loved her but wanted her to be a lady. Her mother loved her but wanted her to be elegant like Sansa. Her brothers loved her but treated her like a little sister who needed protection. Only Lynn. Only he would treat her as a warrior who could wield a sword. Only he would tell her the story of Mulan. He understood her. Lynn, Arya's voice suddenly became very serious. Lynn turned to look at her. When I grow up, I want to marry you. The little girl's face held no hint of a joke. The smile on Lynn's face slowly froze. A single story stole this little girl's heart. Actually, it wasn't that Arya wasn't reserved, it was just that Mulan's story really spoke to her heart. After all, it was a classic from another civilization, how could she resist it? Lynn looked at Arya. She was too young. But he could wait for her to grow up. He urgently needed a foothold, and marrying into the Starks would be the optimal choice right now. Though it would be difficult. After all, Arya was from the Stark family that had ruled the North for thousands of years. The blood of the Lord of Winterfell, the Warden of the North, and the most favored little princess. He was a nobody who had just arrived, with no background or power, a deserter from the Night's Watch, a prisoner who barely secured his safety through a prophecy. Marry him? It didn't look like a match at all. However, Lynn wasn't afraid. For a transmigrator, crossing class boundaries wasn't something hard to do. All right, Lynn reached out and ruffled Arya's messy hair as usual. A smile returned to his face. But you're still young. Let's talk about it when you grow up. Chapter 14, Robert's Arrival. The smile on Lynn's face slowly cooled as Arya disappeared down the corridor, eventually vanishing completely. He returned to his room and closed the door. He was alone, save for the long sword resting across his knees. When I grow up, I want to marry you. Marry him? Lynn clenched his fist. Just surviving like this was far from enough. Living on Ned Stark's pity and suspicion, living on Maester Lewin's ointments and observation. This feeling of his fate being held in another's hands made Lynn tremble deep in his bones. He didn't want charity. What he wanted was the qualification to speak as an equal with the name Stark. He wanted supreme power. As a transmigrator, Lynn knew all the messy affairs of Game of Thrones. This was his unique advantage, apart from the three-eyed raven. Lynn's gaze fell on the blue panel only he could see. And he had the system. This was his most important capital. Survival was just the first step. Now, he wanted more. The king's horn finally sounded over Winterfell. The sound was loud and long, carrying the unique grandeur and flamboyance of the south, tearing through the quiet northern morning. All of Winterfell came alive. Looking down from the highest point of the main keep, a massive procession, like a long golden dragon, was slowly approaching along the King's Road. The crowned stag banner of House Baratheon and the roaring lion banner of House Lannister snapped in the northern wind. Knights' armor flashed dazzlingly in the sunlight. Ladies' carriages were decorated with magnificent curtains. In the courtyard, the Stark family was already waiting in their finest attire. Ned Stark wore a grey fur cloak, his expression solemn. Lady Catelyn stood beside him, wearing an impeccable smile. Robb, in newly tailored leather armor, stood tall like a young pine tree. Sansa wore a sky-blue dress, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her eyes constantly darting toward the golden-haired prince at the front of the procession. Arya wore an iron helm that looked ridiculous on her, her face full of impatience. Little Rickon hid behind his mother, peeking out curiously. Bran, the ever-energetic boy, was there too. Lynn stood behind an inconspicuous pillar, far from the center of the crowd, watching this grand meeting like an outsider. The heavy sound of hooves and wheels crushing the ground grew closer. Robert Baratheon, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, dismounted. It wasn't hard to spot him. Robert was 6'5", towering like a giant tower among the crowd. It would be hard not to notice him. His body was bloated, his face fleshy, the heroic bearing of the demon of the trident from his youth long gone. Back then, clad in armor with a great antlered helm, he was a veritable giant. His warhammer was so heavy even Ned struggled to lift it. Now, things had thoroughly changed. But the majesty of a king still made everyone bow their heads. After the guards placed the mounting block, Robert finally dismounted. Ned led his family to kneel on one knee. Robert walked quickly to Ned with a cold face. He curled his finger upward slightly, signaling Ned to stand and speak. Only after Ned stood up did Catelyn and the rest of the family slowly rise. "Ned. Haven't heard from you in years." Robert's booming voice, tinged with displeasure, echoed in the courtyard. Ned bowed respectfully first, then said, "Guarding the north for you, your grace. Winterfell is yours." Robert examined Ned, whom he hadn't seen in years. After a long while, he spoke slowly. "You've got fat." Ned shrugged slightly. Then he signaled with his eyes for Robert to look at his own out-of-shape figure. Robert broke first and laughed, and Ned joined him. Then Robert opened his arms and gave Ned a solid bear hug. He followed with a hug for Catelyn. Then he began to inspect Ned's children, sparing no praise for each of them. Following closely behind were Queen Cersei Lannister and her twin brother, Jaime Lannister. They were dazzling. Cersei was as beautiful as the rumors said, with deep emerald eyes and golden curls revealing her nobility. Jaime was even more so, a born lion, with a handsome face and shining golden hair, exuding an innate sense of superiority. They wore polite smiles, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. Seeing the Lannisters appear, Ned's expression darkened slightly. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock were the last great house to join Robert's cause during the rebellion. They only declared their stance when Robert and Ned's victory was all but certain. Ned hated such opportunistic people the most. On the other hand, Jaime was the Kingslayer, and Ned had always looked down on him. Even with Jaime's formidable martial prowess, Ned's opinion remained unchanged. Lynn's gaze lingered on them briefly. He knew that beneath those gorgeous skins lay secrets enough to overturn the entire kingdom. Cersei walked elegantly to Ned, smiling superficially, then extended the back of her hand. Ned kissed her hand and said respectfully, "Your Grace." Catelyn also curtsied respectfully. "Your Grace." Cersei nodded slightly and gave a small smile. Seeing that the pleasantries were mostly done, Robert got straight to the point. "Ned, take me to the crypts." Ned knew Robert wanted to see Lyanna Stark's statue. Every deceased Stark was buried in the crypts, with a statue carved by stonemasons. Ned's late father, older brother, and sister were all there. Ned didn't agree immediately. Instead, he looked at Cersei first. Sure enough, Cersei's face looked very unpleasant. Lyanna was the love of Robert's life. Even though she had been taken by Rhaegar and died, she was more important than his lawful wife. Cersei had originally liked Robert. Unfortunately, Robert only treated her as a tool for the alliance between Baratheon and Lannister. Cersei would never forget that on their wedding night, a drunk Robert had called out Lyanna's name while bedding her. This was the shame of her life. Thinking of this, Cersei's expression turned cold. "My love, we've been traveling for a month. Surely the dead can wait." Robert glared at his queen, ignoring her reaction. "Ned." He jerked his head at Ned, signaling him to follow. Ned glanced at Cersei before following Robert. The atmosphere was a bit oppressive. Arya asked Bran in confusion, "Where's the imp?" The imp was Cersei and Jaime's younger brother. A born dwarf. The imp was his nickname. Cersei heard Arya's whispered question. Her face darkened as she walked toward Jaime. Where is our little beast of a brother? Go find him. Chapter 15, The Betrothal. The clamor in the courtyard fell into an eerie silence after Ned and Robert left. Lynn leaned in the shadows of the colonnade, watching the two figures disappear into the entrance of the crypts. One was his nominal monarch. The other was his temporary protector. These two men were brothers and comrades in arms. And both of them were stepping into the abyss. The smile on Queen Cersei Lannister's face had long vanished, her eyes now full of fury. She stared in the direction of the crypts. That gaze looked as if it wanted to burn that dark entrance to ashes. Jaime Lannister stood by her side, wearing a careless smile. With a gloved hand, he gently patted the Queen's tense shoulder, a gesture intimate and ambiguous. "My dear sister, why get angry over a dead person?" His voice was low, carrying a hint of mockery. "A king must have some harmless hobbies." Cersei didn't speak. She simply withdrew her gaze, her cold eyes sweeping across the entire courtyard, finally landing on the Stark children. Especially Sansa. The steps to the crypts were wet and slippery from melted snow. The crypts themselves were always warm because Winterfell was built atop hot springs. Ned and Robert walked among the generations of Stark dead, their footsteps echoing in the vault. The torchlight danced in the narrow passage, stretching their shadows long and distorted. The air was filled with the scent of dust mixed with cold. Robert Baratheon didn't say a word, just panted heavily. His obese body seemed clumsy on the narrow stone steps. Ned followed behind him, equally silent. He could feel the oppressive emotions radiating from the king. It wasn't the majesty of ruling the world. It was a heavy sadness, almost crushing enough to break a man. They passed rows of statues of Stark ancestors. Those cold stone figures, clutching iron swords, watched the visitors quietly. Soon, the two stopped in front of 3 stone sarcophagi arranged side by side. This statue was of Ned's father, Eddard Stark. He sat solemnly, stone fingers tightly gripping the sword lying across his knees. The 2 sarcophagi beside him were his children. One was Ned's older brother, Brandon. The other was Ned's sister, Lyanna. She was only 16 when she died. Now, only Ned's younger brother Benyon remained alive in the world. Robert knelt before Eddard's statue, bowed his head respectfully, and then stood up. "Jon Arryn is dead." Robert's voice suddenly rang out, breaking the suffocating silence. Ned paused. "I know, Your Grace." Robert turned around. The torchlight illuminated half his face, his eyes were bloodshot. "I respected him. Although I don't know how he died. But I know I'm surrounded by vipers, Ned. Liars, cowards, and sycophants. I can't trust anyone." Robert's gaze was fixed dead on Ned's face. "I want you to be my hand." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Ned's heart sank sharply. He thought of Catelyn's worries, of the peaceful years at Winterfell, of his children. He wanted to refuse. So, he knelt on the ground and said tactfully, "Your Grace, I am a Northman. I do not belong in the South. Listen to me, Ned." Robert took a step forward, his massive figure almost completely engulfing Ned. "I'm not here to discuss this with you. I need someone I can trust with my back. In all the 7 kingdoms, I only trust you. And me? I'll eat, drink, and whore my way to an early grave. Damn it, Ned, stand up and talk." Robert pulled Ned up. "You helped me win this damn iron chair, you should find a way to help me keep it. We were meant to rule together. And our houses were meant to be joined, if your sister Lyanna had lived. Fortunately, it's not too late. I have a son, and you have a daughter. They will continue all of this. Ned avoided Robert's gaze. Jon's son. Robert quickly shook his head. He's only 6. Let him inherit the title of Lord of the Eyrie. Ned was somewhat surprised. House Arryn had served as wardens of the East for generations. This was supposed to be a hereditary position. Robert explained, how can a 6-year-old be a warden? He can't lead troops in war. If nothing else works, wait 2 years until he grows up, then give it back to him. Since Robert put it that way, Ned knew the Arryn family had already been arranged by Robert. I'm afraid I've been arranged too, Ned thought. The will of a king cannot be defied. I obey your command, your grace. Ned's voice was very low. Robert got a little angry. Damn it, Ned, stop fucking calling me your grace. Call me that again and I'll beat you to death. Ned gave a helpless smile. After this interruption, the sadness on Robert's face dissipated somewhat, replaced by a trace of exhaustion. Robert turned around to face another statue. Lyanna Stark. The stonemason's skill was excellent, forever freezing her youthful appearance in stone. Even the cold stone statue couldn't hide the wildness and beauty belonging to the north. Robert reached out. That huge hand that once wielded a warhammer was now trembling slightly. With rough fingertips, he gently caressed Lyanna's cold cheek. Why did you have to bury her in a place like this? She should have been with the blue sky and white clouds. Ned. I dream at night, Robert's voice was as light as a sigh. In my dreams, I kill him over and over again. Rigor. I use my warhammer to smash open that fancy armor of his, smash every bone in his body. Over, and over again. In the crypt, there was only the crackling sound of the burning torch. You already killed him, your grace, Ned reminded him softly. Did I? Robert withdrew his hand, the sadness on his face instantly replaced by a bone-deep hatred. But I still haven't hated enough. As long as there is one Targaryen alive, I can't sleep peacefully. His voice rose steeply, echoing in the crypt. That Viserys. And his sister, Daenerys. They are still alive, Ned. They hide across the narrow sea, breeding like cockroaches, waiting to come back one day and take everything from me. In Robert's eyes, a mad fire burned. I want them dead. I want to wipe the name Targaryen from this world completely. Ned felt a chill. That chill rose from the solace of his feet and instantly spread through his limbs. It was colder than the bitterest wind of the north. Killing innocent children? This violated all the honor and principles he believed in. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something. But Robert glared at Ned. You forgot. The Mad King burned your father alive. He put a strangulation device on Brandon and placed him opposite the pyre. Your father's screams made your brother desperately struggle forward. The louder your father screamed, the more your brother couldn't help but move forward to save him. In the end, your brother strangled himself to death, breathing his last before your father. The ministers were forced to watch the execution. The cowardly dared not speak up to stop it, and the loyal ones, as long as they dared to open their mouths, were all hacked to death or exiled. Ned. Have you forgotten all of this? Looking at Robert's face twisted with rage, all of Ned's rebuttal stuck in his throat. Chapter 16, The Infatuated Sansa. The Great Hall of Winterfell was baked into a noisy and sweltering furnace by hundreds of tallow candles and roaring fireplaces. In the air, the aroma of roasting boar fat mixed with the sour smell of spilled ale. Together, these scents formed a dizzying wave of heat. The bard's lute music was torn to shreds by King Robert's coarse laughter and the loud toasts of the lords. Burly warriors, bare-chested, embraced delicate prostitutes in their arms. Lynn stood in the most inconspicuous corner of the hall, holding a cup of ale. The stone pillar behind him was cold, isolating most of the heat. Lynn was like a ghost, indifferently watching this grand and hypocritical tableau before him. Ned Stark sat in the seat of honor. He drank cup after cup with Robert. But the smile on his face was stiff, like a mask. Lady Catelyn circulated among the noble ladies from the south. Her demeanor was impeccable, but the worry deep in her eyes flickered in and out under the candle light. Soon, Catelyn left. She was going to help Sansa tidy up. Tonight, Sansa would be the protagonist, and Catelyn didn't want the southern ladies to see anything amiss. Lynn's gaze swept through the crowd. He saw Jaime Lannister. The Kingslayer was whispering something to his sister, Queen Cersei, eliciting a coquettish laugh from her. But no one noticed. Their beauty seemed so out of place in this chaotic environment, and so dangerous. Lynn drained the ale in his cup. The spicy liquid slid down his throat but couldn't dispel the chill in his heart. He turned and left the clamor. Walking through a corridor hung with antler chandeliers, the cold air outside cleared his muddled head significantly. A suppressed, hushed conversation came from a window embrasure not far ahead. It was Lady Catelyn and Sansa. Sansa's voice held an urgency soaked in wine and fantasy. Her sky-blue dress glowed softly in the moonlight, and her pretty face was full of a young girl's longing for the future. Prince Joffrey is so handsome, so brave. I will be his queen. When will we get married? Is it now, or do we wait? Although he couldn't see Lady Catelyn, Lynn could imagine the expression on her face right now. Exhaustion, worry, and a trace of helplessness. Sansa, listen. Catelyn's voice was soft, but held an unquestionable seriousness. Don't get excited. Your father hasn't agreed yet. Sansa asked in confusion, why wouldn't he agree? He will soon be the hand of the king, second only to one man. Speaking of this, Sansa revealed an excited smile. Catelyn's face was bitter. Then he would have to leave his home. And leave me. Of course, you would leave home too. Sansa's expression held a trace of confusion. Didn't you also leave your home to come to Winterfell? And one day I will be queen. Sansa suddenly turned her head. Please, make father agree. Catelyn wanted to say something else, but was interrupted by the urgent Sansa. Please. Marrying a prince, this is my life's wish. Catelyn looked at her daughter's longing gaze, was silent for a long time, and then spoke slowly. This isn't a song sung by northern bards. Being a queen isn't just about wearing pretty dresses and attending balls. I understand. Sansa interrupted her mother, her voice rising slightly with the grievance of being misunderstood. I will be a good queen, just like Queen Nymeria in the legends. I will bear him golden-haired princes. Mother, please, make father agree quickly. I don't want to stay in Winterfell anymore, it's cold and boring here. The girl's plea was like a fine needle piercing Lady Catelyn's heart. Lynn's face held no expression. He had no sympathy, nor disdain. He was just like the calmest chess player, watching a piece destined for sacrifice happily walk toward a trap. From this moment on, Sansa's fate was firmly bound to that blood-stained Iron Throne. And he was powerless to stop it, nor did he want to. Sansa was already blinded by power. Ned Stark must go south. This was the king's order, a close friend's request, and his inescapable responsibility as Warden of the North. Lynn's gaze passed through the window, looking deep into the courtyard. There, an ancient abandoned tower stood in the night, like a broken fang. A thought flashed through Lynn's mind. That was where Bran would fall, and it was also the greatest benefit he could seize for himself right now. Lynn silently retreated, blending back into the shadows and leaving the corridor. He didn't go back to his room. Instead, he crossed the noisy courtyard and walked to the other side of the castle. It was far from the lights of the main keep, only the torches of patrolling guards cast swaying spots of light in the darkness. Lynn arrived at the base of the abandoned tower. The first keep, the oldest part of Winterfell. He looked up at the dilapidated walls. He knew that Bran Stark, the boy who loved to climb, would fall from high above. He would see things he shouldn't see. Jaime and Cersei's secret. And this secret would be like a stone thrown into a lake, stirring up monstrous waves. Saving Bran wasn't out of any noble morality. Lynn had little morality to speak of, he wasn't the pedantic Stark. What would a healthy, uncrippled Bran Stark mean to the Stark family? And what would he, who saved the Lord's second son at a critical moment, gain? It would no longer be simple trust. It would be a gratitude sufficient to change Lynn's fate. A chip that would allow him to truly shed his prisoner status and gain a foothold. This was the first, and most critical, piece he could place in this Game of Thrones. Lynn wouldn't allow himself to miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Before he had power, he could only use schemes, just like Lord Baelish, Littlefinger. Lynn had to act, but not recklessly. He couldn't just rush up and tell everyone there was a problem in the tower. That would not only get him treated as a madman but would also dilute the Starks' gratitude toward him. He needed a perfect timing, an unquestionable excuse, a reason that would make his presence at the scene of the incident seem coincidental and reasonable. Lynn's gaze began to scan the surrounding environment. Below the tower was a forgotten clearing, overgrown with weeds and scattered with abandoned stone materials. It was very secluded, almost no one would come here. Except, for the boy who liked to climb everywhere. And, of course, the golden-haired siblings who liked to have affairs. He now needed to understand Bran's habits, his climbing routes, and the times he usually appeared. Starting tomorrow, he would lie in wait here, day after day. Until that day when Bran and the blonde siblings appeared on this tower together. Lynn withdrew his gaze, turned, and left. Chapter 17, Benyon Stark. The clamor of the banquet was sealed away by the thick stone walls. Beneath the first keep, there was only the sound of the wind. It whistled through the crenellations, rolling up dead leaves and ice from the ground. Lynn stood in the quiet shadows. The long sword in his hand reflected cold, fluid glints under the clear moonlight. He didn't practice wide, sweeping moves. Just the most basic thrusts, blocks, and dodges. He repeated every movement hundreds of times. The soreness in his muscles refined his control over this body bit by bit. Sweat slid down Lynn's forehead, quickly dried by the cold night wind, taking away the last trace of warmth from his skin. Footsteps approached from the distance. They were light, carrying a hint of hesitation. Lynn paused his movements, but his grip on the sword didn't relax in the slightest. He turned around. Jon Snow stood not far away, also holding a blunt practice sword. He wasn't wearing banquet finery, just simple black leather armor. On that handsome face that didn't belong to the Stark look, there was a loneliness that clashed with the festive atmosphere. "I thought I was the only one here," Jon's voice was low. Lynn sheathed his sword. "Me too." Jon walked over and stood beside Lynn. He looked at the brightly lit tower in the night, silent for a long time. "They are all inside," Jon's tone was flat, devoid of emotion. "Cheering, drinking, celebrating the king's arrival. And I can only stand here." Lynn didn't speak. He knew Lady Catelyn wouldn't allow Jon at the high table. On such a grand occasion, the presence of a bastard was the greatest insult to her. Jon smiled self-deprecatingly. "Sometimes, I really want to leave this place." He raised his blunt sword and swung at the dummy. "Go somewhere no one knows me. Go somewhere my last name isn't Snow." His gaze fell on Lynn. There was a questioning look in those eyes. "Tell me, is the wall really my only destination?" Before Lynn could answer, another voice sounded from the shadows behind them. "The wall isn't anyone's destination, lad." The voice was steady, carrying the unique rasp of the North. Lynn's pupils contracted sharply. A figure on horseback emerged from the darkness. He wore worn black clothing, had a lean build, and a face chiseled by wind and frost. Those eyes were as sharp as a hawk's. It was Benyon Stark, Lord Ned's younger brother, first ranger of the Night's Watch. Uncle Benyon. The loneliness on Jon's face was swept away, replaced by the surprise of seeing family. He respected Benyon just like his own father, Ned. Benyon nodded to Jon as a greeting. His gaze, however, passed over Jon and landed directly on Lynn. It was a scrutinizing gaze, but without hostility. "You're that crow that flew back," Benyon's tone was calm, stating a fact. "When I returned to the wall, the watch all said you were a deserter." Lynn didn't defend himself. He just quietly met Benyon's gaze. Benyon's eyes moved from Lynn's face to his hand gripping the sword hilt, and finally to the packed snow under his feet where countless footprints from repetitive practice were left. The corner of Benyon's mouth hooked up in a tiny arc. "A deserter wouldn't train like this. I heard about the bandits, too. You did well." Benyon walked forward a few steps, the cold radiating from him hitting their faces. It was the chill that only comes from years spent at the wall, soaking into the marrow. "I've seen you fight wildlings with my own eyes, I know you're no coward. And on my ranging this time, I also saw evidence of the White Walkers." Benyon concluded, "I'll explain everything to my brother. The watch needs a warrior like you, not a corpse hanging on a gallows." Lynn's heart gave a powerful thump. A warm current spread from his chest to his limbs. The first ranger's promise. This carried more weight than any defense. It meant the sword named deserter hanging over his head was finally removed. "Thank you, my lord." Lynn bowed slightly, his voice carrying a relief even he hadn't noticed. "Haven't seen you in 2 months, and you've learned some manners." Benyon waved his hand, signaling Lynn not to stand on ceremony. His gaze returned to Jon. "You've grown." A smile appeared on Benyon's face. "I rode all night just so you wouldn't have to face the Lannisters' annoying feast alone. You know my brother Ned, every time he attends these boring banquets, he's like a bear trapped in a cage. Aren't you going inside for the feast?" Jon smiled bitterly. "Lady Stark thinks a bastard sitting with royalty would be an insult to them." Benyon nodded understandingly. No one knew Jon Snow's situation better than he did. He cared about Jon. "Well, there are no such annoying restrictions on the wall. A bastard can take a seat anytime." Jon stood up straight. He looked at his uncle, a light burning in his grey eyes like never before. "Then take me with you when you go back. As long as you speak to father, he will agree. I want to be a night's watchman. At the wall, birth doesn't matter. I have no family name, only brothers." Benyon's expression didn't change. He just looked at his nephew, at his face flushed with excitement. "You have no idea what you're saying," Benyon said. "We have no families. Once you wear the black, you can never take a wife, never father children. Do you think this is some hero's game? We face wildlings, the eternal winter, things more terrible than death." Jon was different from when he asked Lynn last time, his eyes held unprecedented determination. "I don't care. I'm ready to swear my vows to the Night's Watch." Lynn understood that Catelyn's actions today had deeply hurt Jon. "You're just a boy," Benyon's tone softened a little. "When you know what it means, you'll likely regret it. Stay in Winterfell, Jon. When you're older, when you truly understand what you're giving up, come tell me these words again." With that, Benyon stopped looking at him. He patted Lynn on the shoulder. "Kid, I'm going in first. Remember to come find me later." Then, Benyon turned and melted back into the deep darkness. In the courtyard, only Jon and Lynn remained. And the ceaseless wind. Jon stood dazed in place. After a long time, he looked up at Lynn, his voice hoarse. "Is what Uncle Benyon said true? Am I too naive?" Lynn looked at him. Looked at this future Lord Commander, at the vulnerability on his face that didn't match his age. Lynn didn't comfort him. He simply said calmly, "The path is your own choice, Jon. No one can walk it for you." Chapter 18, First Meeting with Tyrion. Jon Snow's figure appeared exceptionally thin under the cold moonlight. His sword hung by his side, and his whole body looked as if the bones had been pulled out of it. Uncle Benion's words cut deeper than the north wind. Lynn offered no words of comfort. He just stood quietly by the side, letting Jon digest this cruel reality on his own. Sympathy was the cheapest thing in this world. Jon needed to walk out of this himself. Suddenly, a voice came from the shadows behind them, carrying a hint of drunkenness and amusement. "It seems not everyone enjoys the noise of a feast." Lynn's muscles tensed instantly, his fingers tightening slightly on his sword hilt. He spun around. A short figure walked out from the shadow of the colonnade. He was only half the height of an ordinary man. But his well-tailored fine clothes and the silver cup filled with crimson wine in his hand proclaimed his noble status. Tyrion Lannister, Queen Cersei's brother, known as the IMP. A reckless smile hung on his face, and his mismatched eyes twinkled under the moonlight with a cunning that seemed to see through everything. Tyrion's gaze fell straight onto Jon. "Let me guess. You must be Ned Stark's bastard." Jon's face darkened instantly, his hand gripping his sword until his knuckles turned white. The surname Snow was an unhealable scar on him. And Tyrion was mercilessly poking that scar with his finger. Tyrion seemed not to see the anger on Jon's face and took a sip of wine on his own. "Is your uncle a night's watchman?" Jon turned to face the dwarf. "What are you doing here?" Tyrion shrugged. "Working up the courage to dine with your family. I've actually always wanted to see the wall." Snow ignored that and asked, "You are Tyrion Lannister? Cersei's brother?" Tyrion took a gulp of wine and mocked himself. "Yes, that's perhaps my greatest achievement. You have the gloomy look of a Northman, but your face is much finer than your half-siblings. That usually comes from the mother's side. Did I offend you just now?" "Sorry, I shouldn't have brought up the bastard thing." Tyrion swirled his wine cup, ripples spreading in the liquid. "Don't look at me like that, boy." Jon's lips moved, but he couldn't say a word. "You are indeed a bastard. Your father is Ned Stark, and your mother is not Lady Stark. Never forget what you are, for the world will not. Wear it like armor, and it can never be used to hurt you." Jon was stunned. Then, anger welled up in his heart. "What do you know? What do you know about being a bastard?" Tyrion looked straight into Jon's eyes. "All dwarfs are bastards in their father's eyes. What difference is there between you and me?" Looking at Tyrion's diminutive stature, the anger in Jon's heart dissipated instantly. Tyrion's gaze moved from Jon to Lynn. He looked Lynn up and down. From Lynn's wash-faded black clothes to the sharp sword in his hand, and finally to those eyes that remained calm in the night. "And you? You don't look like a dwarf. Are you a bastard like him too?" Tyrion asked with interest. "Oh, no, you're not a Stark. You have the smell of a crow on you." Lynn didn't speak, just met his gaze calmly. This dwarf exuded a dangerous aura. It wasn't a threat of physical force, but an oppressive feeling stemming from intellect. A night's watchman, not warming himself with a plump whore at the feast, but standing here in the ice and snow blowing in the cold wind with the Lord's bastard. Tyrion took another sip of wine, the smile on his lips deepening. "What an interesting combination." "The feast is too loud," Lynn finally spoke, his voice flattened somewhat by the wind. "Oh." Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? I find that this level of noise is perfect for covering up certain, less pleasant sounds. Like lies, conspiracies, and other things." His gaze lingered on the long sword at Lynn's waist for a moment. Lynn knew there was a hidden meaning in Tyrion's words. But Lynn had indeed just come out for some fresh air. This dwarf was far more sober than he appeared. "How is the wall?" Tyrion changed the subject, his tone becoming lighter. I've always wanted to see that end of the world. I heard there are wildlings there, and, more terrible things. His tone carried a trace of mockery, as if talking about an absurd fairy tale. The wall is cold, Lynn answered simply and directly. Colder than Winterfell. Tyrion laughed. It seems the eloquence of the Night's Watch is as lackluster as the northern weather. He drained the last bit of wine from his cup and tossed the expensive silver goblet into the snow. All right, two gloomy gentlemen. I'm going to find something warmer and softer to pass this night. He winked his black eye at Jon. Remember my words, boy. There's nothing bad about being a bastard, at least you don't have to attend those boring feasts. With that, Tyrion hummed an out-of-tune southern ditty and waddled away on his short legs, disappearing at the other end of the courtyard. In the snow, only a lonely silver cup and a trail of uneven footprints remained. Jon still stood in place, as if nailed to the ground. After a long time, he slowly exhaled a breath, which condensed into a white mist in the cold air. He's right. Jon's voice was low, but no longer held the confusion from before. He looked up at Lynn, a light rekindling in his eyes. It wasn't the light of finding a home, but a resilience born from breaking through the soil after recognizing reality. Lynn didn't respond. His gaze passed over Jon's shoulder, looking toward the brightly lit tower in the distance. After a long while. Lord Benyon is still waiting for me. Lynn patted Jon's shoulder, then walked toward the banquet hall. Chapter 19, Dispelling Doubts. Lynn pushed open the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall. A wave of heat, mixed with the smell of roasting meat grease, spilled ale, and sweat, hit him in the face, carried by the sounds of lutes and rowdy voices. The hall was as bright as day. Hundreds of tallow candles burned on antler chandeliers, casting flickering light. The flames in the fireplaces roared, illuminating the alcohol-flushed faces of the lords, making them look even more ferocious. King Robert was already dead drunk. He had his arm around a plump serving girl, slurring as he bragged about his prowess on the trident in his youth. Queen Cersei watched coldly from the side, a trace of icy ridicule hanging on her lips. Beside her sat an uninterested Catelyn. Lynn's gaze swept quickly through the crowd. Soon, he found the people he was looking for by a fireplace on one side of the hall. Ned Stark and Benyon Stark. The two brothers were not participating in the revelry. Instead, they stood in the shadows, conversing in low voices. Ned's face wore unconcealed exhaustion and worry. And Benyon, the first ranger, exuded a chill from the wall even in the warm hall. Lynn walked straight through the noisy crowd toward them. "My lords," Lynn said softly. Benyon turned around, his hawk-sharp eyes lingering on Lynn for a moment. "I was just telling Ned about you," Benyon's voice was gentle. He turned to his brother. "Ned, this kid isn't a deserter." Ned Stark remained silent. His gray eyes held complex emotions. He looked at Lynn, seeming to wait for an explanation. "Everyone on the wall says he fled out of fear of punishment," Benyon continued, his voice carrying the rasp characteristic of Northmen. "But I saw him fight for his life against wildlings with my own eyes. He lay in the snow with the bodies of 3 wildlings around him. A coward couldn't do that." Ned nodded. "A few days ago, he risked his life against bandits, killing 6 of them alone. He is indeed a good man." Benyon turned his gaze back to Ned. "Ned. On my patrol this time, back in the haunted forest, I found something. Something that shouldn't exist." Even in this noisy banquet, Benyon's voice was deliberately kept very low. "White Walkers." These 2 words caused Ned's pupils to contract sharply. He looked abruptly at Lynn. Lynn's prophecy, Benyon's testimony. In this moment, they overlapped perfectly. It was no longer Lynn's nonsense. It was a warning from beyond the wall. Ned's breathing hitched for a moment. He remembered that morning. Remembered holding the Valyrian greatsword ice against this young man's neck. The cold edge had already broken the skin. If he had used just a fraction more force, a head would have rolled in the snow. He would have ended this crow who brought ominous prophecies with his own hands, just like executing any other deserter. But he had hesitated in the end. Now it seemed that hesitation had saved this young man's life. And perhaps, saved the entire North. Ned's suspicion was finally completely dispelled. An indescribable emotion welled up from the bottom of his heart. It wasn't simple trust. It was relief. Relief that he hadn't been blinded by anger and prejudice. Relief that he had chosen to believe in that 1 in 10,000 possibility. The tense lines of Ned's jaw slowly relaxed. He looked at Lynn, the scrutiny and suspicion in his gray eyes faded, leaving only a deep, complex expression bordering on recognition. The Night's Watch indeed needs a warrior like you, Ned finally spoke, his voice low and powerful. But the North needs you more right now. This sentence exploded in Lynn's mind like a thunderclap. He was no longer the prisoner who needed to be sent back to the wall. He was no longer the deserter who had to trade prophecies for survival. Ned Stark's words gave him a new identity. One recognized by the Warden of the North and kept as one of their own. Benyon looked at his brother. Ned, the Night's Watch has its own rules. Ned understood Benyon's meaning. He didn't shy away from it. I know this doesn't fit your rules. If anyone who commits a crime can join the Watch, and then abandon their vows to leave, it treats the Watch's vows as child's play. What rules would remain? But Lynn has the prophecies of the old gods, and I need his help. Benyon, if what he says is true, the North is destined for turmoil. This concerns the safety of the entire North. If the North falls, who will provide supplies to the Night's Watch? Those southern lords. Benyon looked at Ned in surprise. It was the first time he had seen Ned like this. His impression of his brother had always been of rigid uprightness. Not having seen him for a few months, he had changed a lot. At least Benyon thought this was a good thing. House Stark needed sharper minds, not a bunch of stubborn mules. Indeed, most of the Night's Watch's supplies came from House Stark. If the Starks were finished, the Night's Watch would naturally be finished too. They rose and fell together. Benyon smiled and nodded, not refusing. I'll explain this to the Lord Commander. You are my brother, and he understands the stakes involved. Lord Commander Mormont will agree. Ned hesitated for a moment and added, if he cannot leave the Watch, then let him go south as a man of the Night's Watch. That way, it won't count as abandoning his vows. Benyon laughed. I'll try to get Lynn released from the Watch first. If the Lord Commander reacts strongly, that method will be a fallback. Ned relaxed. Good, let's do it that way. Ned looked at Lynn again, as if waiting for a response. I understand, my lord. Lynn lowered his eyes, hiding the gleam that flashed through them. Benyon patted Lynn on the shoulder, hard. Do well, kid. Don't shame the Night's Watch. With that, Benyon raised his cup and drained it. I don't belong at this feast. I'll talk to you about John tomorrow. I'm going to the crypts for a while. Benyon signaled to Ned, turned, and left the banquet. By the fireplace, only Ned and Lynn remained. The flames crackled, casting their shadows on the stone wall behind them. The king wants me to go south, to King's Landing, to take Jon Arryn's place. Ned's voice held a trace of exhaustion. He wasn't asking for an opinion, just stating a fact. You will accept, Lynn said calmly. Ned wasn't surprised. He looked at Lynn and suddenly asked, you said before that this is the beginning of a tragedy. What else did you see? Lynn raised his head to meet Ned's gaze. He knew the real show was about to begin. Chapter 20, guiding Ned step by step. Ned's gaze tried to chisel through Lynn's calm facade, to see the secrets deep in his soul. What else did you see? This question, amidst the crackling of the fireplace, seemed exceptionally heavy. Lynn didn't answer immediately. He just raised his eyes, calmly meeting the Warden of the North's gaze. In those eyes, there was no fear, no evasion, only a bottomless serenity. "My lord," Lynn's voice was soft, but incredibly clear. "I know you have many questions for me, but my ability to prophesy comes with a price. Some futures are like forks in the dark. I can see that one path ends in a cliff. But if you know the location of the cliff right now, you might be so eager to avoid it that you overlook the trap at your feet, and end up falling into another abyss." These words were more persuasive than any profound prophecy. Ned's tense body finally relaxed a little. He understood. Lynn wasn't trying to be mysterious, but was explaining a cruel truth in a way he could grasp. Knowing too much might not be a good thing. Forcibly reversing a known tragedy would very likely trigger a series of even more violent backlashes. Once the gears of fate were forcibly turned, they would only crush those who tried to resist in a more tragic way. Seeing Ned's silence, Lynn spoke up. "My lord, on this trip south, I have seen some things that will happen, and I will tell you the solutions one by one. First, do not be in a hurry to investigate the cause of Lord Eddard's death. You only need to be wary of Cersei, Janos Slynt, and Baelish. Pay special attention to Baelish. Whatever he says to you, my lord, just go along with him, but do not believe a single word he says. Not one word. The man has no honor to speak of. Second, if you are too eager for success, the gold cloaks are fence-sitters and will inevitably betray you. If you want to thoroughly investigate Lord Eddard's death, you should first weaken the city watch, or better yet, take control of it yourself. The gold cloaks, named for their golden cloaks, answered directly to the Iron Throne and were an important force for maintaining law and order in the capital. At least, the superficial order. After King Robert's death, Ned could have controlled the situation as regent, but Littlefinger betrayed him. This directly led the Gold Cloaks to side with Cersei, resulting in Ned's arrest and the subsequent tragedy. Third, and most importantly, His Grace King Robert's situation is far more dangerous than you think. You just need to remember one thing. As long as he lives, you live. You must keep a close eye on Robert's food and daily life, and do not let him go hunting. Ned's body shook, and anxiety appeared on his face. You mean, someone wants to kill Robert? Who would be so bold? Lynn shook his head, refusing to answer this question. My lord, I can only see fragments. As for the rest, I'm not too sure either. The lions were entrenched in King's Landing. Wanting to go head-to-head with them, how could a few people from the north fight against these locals? That was simply impossible. Lynn wanted Ned to gain a firm foothold first, establish a good defense, and wait until his own power developed and stabilized before making any moves. If he told Ned directly, Lynn was afraid the upright Ned would get hot-headed, causing irreversible consequences. I understand, Ned nodded seriously. I will do as you say. Lynn added another layer of insurance for Ned. My lord, if an accident really happens to King Robert, you need to support Joffrey's ascension and agree to any conditions Cersei proposes, including showing goodwill, flattery. While their guard is down, return to the north immediately. As long as you sit in the north, no matter what changes occur in King's Landing, you will be safe and sound. Just one thing. Lynn looked straight into Ned's eyes and spoke slowly. I'm afraid you won't be flexible. Ned waved his large hand. Don't worry, I'll do as you say. He wasn't a fool. Hearing Lynn's arrangements one by one, he smelled the scent of danger. Since he chose to believe Lynn, he would follow this path to the end. Even if Lynn wanted to harm him, he had no choice. Ned gazed at the young man before him. This crow who fled back from the wall, this variable, bearing a mysterious prophetic ability. Lynn, can I trust you? Lynn nodded slightly, his tone holding no flattery, only the calm of stating a fact. It was you who pardoned me, my lord. Everything I have is tied to Winterfell, and to the entire north. Getting the answer, Ned no longer pursued those ethereal futures. He made a decision. After the king leaves, you and Benyon will return to the wall together to explain your breach of vows to the Lord Commander. When you return, I will give you a brand new identity. Ned looked at him, word by word. Become my personal guard and accompany me south to King's Landing. This sentence carried more weight than any gold dragons or fiefdoms. It meant Lynn would completely wash away the stigma of being a prisoner and deserter, finding a fulcrum where he could stand firm. Even if this fulcrum was the precarious House Stark. But for Lynn, who urgently needed a springboard, it was enough. Lynn lowered his eyes, hiding the surge of emotion in that instant. As you command, my lord. Dash. At the other end of the banquet hall, the atmosphere was far less heavy than in the study. Sitting high in the seat of honor, Cersei Lannister was boringly running her slender fingertips along the rim of a tall silver goblet. Beside her, Catelyn wore a perfectly measured smile, responding to the Queen's small talk. But in those blue eyes of House Tully, there hid a lingering cloud. This is your first time in the north, isn't it, Your Grace? Catelyn spoke up, trying to break the awkward silence. Cersei's gaze passed over her, landing on Sansa not far away. The girl was gazing infatuatedly at her son, Joffrey. A smile that was almost imperceptible spilled from the corner of Cersei's mouth. Yes, it is indeed, different here. Catelyn's smile was a bit stiff. I dare say, compared to King's Landing, it must be very harsh here. When I first arrived, I also felt fear. Harsh. Cersei's voice was like the finest silk in King's Landing, smooth, but without a trace of warmth. More than harsh. The wind here can turn a woman's skin into sandpaper. Catelyn's hand tightened around her wine cup. Just then, a figure walked up to the table with a mix of urgency and longing. It was Sansa. She had changed into a brand new sky blue dress, her hair was meticulously combed, and her face flushed with a moving red from excitement. Your Grace. Sansa lifted her skirt and performed an impeccable curtsy. Mother. Cersei's gaze slowly swept over Sansa. That look didn't seem like she was looking at a future daughter-in-law, but more like appraising a valuable filly about to enter the market. Hello, my beautiful little dove, Cersei spoke, her tone rarely carrying praise. You are truly beautiful. Sansa's heart leaped for joy at this compliment. Cersei put down her wine cup and leaned forward slightly, getting closer to Sansa. Those emerald eyes twinkled with a shrewdness that saw through everything. How old are you, child? 13, Your Grace, Sansa answered obediently. 13. Cersei looked at her figure, which was already taking shape. Still growing. Sansa didn't understand but nodded with a smile. I think so, Your Grace. Cersei lightly ran her fingertip along the wall of the goblet, making a soft ringing sound. Then, she asked that question. Have you bled yet? The air seemed to freeze in this instant. The flush on Sansa's face instantly turned from the rosy hue of excitement to the crimson of shame. She opened her mouth but couldn't say a word, only looking to her mother for help. Catelyn's face darkened instantly. A surge of anger at being blatantly offended rose from the bottom of her heart. For the first time, those blue eyes held undisguised hostility. In the north, on her home ground, right in front of her face, to humiliate her daughter like this. Cersei, however, seemed not to see the anger in Catelyn's eyes. She just picked up her wine cup, gently swirling the crimson liquid inside, a playful smile on her lips. Not yet, Your Grace, Sansa's voice was as thin as a mosquito's. Oh. Cersei seemed a bit disappointed, then smiled, and changed the subject. The dire wolf embroidered on your dress is very well done. Did you make it yourself? Sansa nodded hurriedly, like grasping at a straw. Yes, Your Grace. What a clever and deft girl, Cersei smiled kindly. Make something for me in the future too. Sansa agreed, flattered. After curtsying, she almost fled back to her seat. Cersei turned her nonchalant gaze back to Catelyn. The smile on her face remained unchanged, but her words were incredibly cold. The whole Seven Kingdoms are waiting for our two families to have grandchildren. Catelyn suppressed her anger and squeezed out a stiff smile. I've heard some rumors as well. Cersei's gaze turned to Sansa again. Your daughter will be the apple of the court's eye, the queen said in a tone like a proclamation. Such a delicate flower shouldn't be buried in the ice and snow of the north. Catelyn's expression became as cold as the winter snow outside the window. On the other side, Sansa, having returned to her seat, soon had her embarrassment replaced by another emotion. Prince Joffrey was looking at her, a charming smile on his handsome face, raising his wine cup to her from afar. Boom! Sansa felt her cheeks were about to burn up. She lowered her head in a panic, pulling the female companion beside her and incoherently saying something, trying to hide the sweetness and secret delight that was almost spilling out of her chest. That humiliating question from the queen had long been thrown to the back of her mind.